Thanks a lot. I want to thank Eric as the one who communicated with me, but obviously to all of INDEP for inviting me to talk about this model, which I've been very, very slowly evolving over the years. I'm going to talk, Eric's told me that we got about an hour and a half and that my presentation should not go over 45 minutes. So they got me lots of time for questions and discussion. So I think the information density of this presentation is going to be fairly high. So more than 45 minutes would simply not be, it would be too tiring anyways. But in any case, the target is going to be for 45 minutes. And so I'll get started to try to make sure we have enough time. And I will be reading it, most of it, because there's going to be a lot I want to say. So this talk will indeed present a number of the details of a particular prevision of a socialist organization of social production, protagonistic planned socialism, or PROPLASO. I do not, however, want to disappear down the rabbit hole of justifying scores of specific features of PROPLASO versus those of other models of democratic planned socialism family. Rather, as a necessary background for understanding the specifics that I have for PROPLASO, the first half of the talk will be about why humanity needs democratic planned socialism, its goals, and the role of previsions in general in promoting those goals. With that established, and that is the basis for talking about why I have the prefigurative model that I have, the second half of the talk will then be, indeed, indicate quite a number of the specifics of my prevision. But before I jump into the presentation, I want to quickly make three notes about the presentation. Note number one, the necessity of the inclusion of a consideration of the goals of socialism for any discussion of any concrete prevision or prefigurative model of socialism. My first note is that it's pointless to discuss the specifics of my prevision or any prevision if one does not start discussing what one understands as the purpose of socialism, the goals of socialism. A person has a model that has specifics and they want to argue that those specifics are good, and that's why the model is good, but it's meaningless to say something is good if one doesn't say good for what. So my claim, and the implicit claim of any other model, is that the specifics I propose are good in enabling the system to achieve its goals, and so one needs to begin by discussing the goals of the model of socialism, what one understands as the goals. The English language aphorism, which is often expressed in similar but different words, states this tersely: you can't pick what road you want to take if you don't know where you want to go. Note concerning the goals of socialism that there's a lot of broad social agreement about what they are, particularly in general, and also at the same time individual differences about some goals, particularly about more detailed things. So I'll return to this point about goals as the first of the 6 points of the presentation. Pre-note 2, the purpose of a discussion about previsions or prefigurative models of socialism is not, so here's all the solutions to all the controversial and contested issues about socialism, democracy, and planning, just follow the recipes. To the contrary, if humanity, or any significant sizable part of humanity, shifts from capitalism to some form of democratic planned socialism, what it shifts to will be socially constructed. That is how it was for the many different varieties of capitalism existing in the world today. That is how it was for the many different types of feudalism, and so on. In that frame, previsions like the one I will present, and scores of others, should be understood as contributions to the necessary social discussion on what we want the democratic planned socialist alternative to capitalism to be, which we would like to construct, what we would like it to look like. Then in practice, what is being socially constructed will pick up pieces from here and pieces from there that people have suggested over the years and put them together in different ways in different places, and also develop new things in the process of combining and modifying previously proposed ideas. And so again, to stress, what I am putting out here needs to be understood as a contribution to that necessary social discussion. So I'm going to return to this point in the second and third parts of the presentation. Now, the third point here is this website, www.dac27ch. In a single lecture presentation of something as big as a model of democratic planned socialism, one of course can neither present it fully nor argue all the reasons one has for why one made it the way one did. Of course, one really needs to write a book to do these, and a number of advocates of various different models of democratic planned socialism have. But an article can at least go into those issues beyond what one can do in a single talk. So I have a website where I have posted the bulk of my published articles over the last 25 years. So this is the opening page of the website of mine. It's just a picture of lecturing to a typical first day class as capitalist pressures on our class size continue to increase. But if you click on the selected article, it actually takes you to a list of all my articles. So the article that's currently 7th from the top, the white line that's partway down the page, is my presentation of the 2022 iteration of the PROPLASO in Science and Society, called Moving Beyond Capitalism, Human Development, and Protagonistic Planned Socialism. The second half of this talk will parallel that article, and there you can see points brought up here addressed beyond what I say here. Now, many, but not all, of the points presented in the first half of the talk are developed further in the student reader chapter presented in the second stripe from the top, the second article from the top, Democratic Planned Socialism, Moving Beyond Capitalism to Support and Promote Human Development. So with that, I'll now jump into the presentation. So the presentation will have 6 sections. The first one will address the question of the goals of socialism, which the first of the 3 pre-presentation notes already brought up. Second section will pick up on the second pre-presentation note and discuss further what the purpose is of developing prevision of a desirable alternative to capitalism. And the third section continue that discussion, highlighting the Goldilocks dilemma for such prefigurative models. In the fourth section, I just want to briefly say 3 things about democratic planned socialism as a family of prefigurative models, a family which is today continually growing as part of the growing global discontent with capitalism. With the first 4 sections presented as necessary background for understanding the fundamental nature of PROPLASO, the 5th section will jump into some of its features. In the first place, it will denote its 3 fundamental pillars, but then it's going to go on to indicate some general and some mid-level concrete procedures from its first 2 pillars. So after this progression of the talk from presenting the very general background issues to finally discussing general and mid-level concrete features of PROPLASO, once they can be understood in the frame of the general background issues, I will end by jumping back to something that I consider to be background to where the talk started with the goals of socialism. As a logical construct in the sense of mathematics, one could start by assuming the desirability of replacing capitalism and starting with the goals of socialism as postulates, and then develop everything from there. An alternative is to argue that the desirability of replacing capitalism and socialism's goals themselves come out of aspects of human nature. There are a couple of things in this final material on human nature that I want to leave people with to think about, especially concerning the word protagonism in the title, and also the issues of individuality and our social connectedness. And putting this material right at the start would derail us getting to the concrete presentations of PROPLASO, so I'm putting it at the end. So before starting with section 1 of the presentation, I want to flag 5 debatable issues that PROPLASO takes a position on. These are all issues that are very much part of the social discussion about socialism going on today, and I would expect that some listening today might have different positions on them than those that are incorporated into PROPLASO. But of course, once again, that's the whole point of a social discussion. And in my presentation, you will not only get my position on these issues, as for example, I hold that markets are not incompatible with socialism or social economic planning, but that what is called market socialism is not democratic planned socialism because it has circuits of capital that are incompatible with socialism. That's my position. But you will also get an indication of why I hold those positions. And we can certainly continue to further discuss out these debated issues in the questions and comments time. So the 5 issues here are the nature of wages in a socialist mode of production, consumer consoles, the possibility of simple commodity producers in a socialist mode of production. If a system has markets, can it do the social planning needed to make it a socialist mode of production? And money in a socialist mode of production. Okay, that's only about 10 minutes, I guess, going into the talk, and I'm sort of on schedule, so let's see if we can keep going. Part 1, why should society replace capitalism? What are the goals of socialism? Without needing to get deeply philosophical, it's sufficient to say that for people who want to replace any social system, they need to hold 2 positions. First, they need to deem that there are a number of things that they want the social system being considered to do that they hold that it is not doing. Another way to say this is that they must deem that there are a number of goals that they consider the social system being considered should have and should be successfully promoting that they hold the existing system is not promoting. Second, to want to replace the existing social system, they need to consider that it cannot be modified or reformed to promote the same goals. This, of course, is the difference between reformists and revolutionaries for addressing things about capitalism that they both agree they don't like, and not the issue of the means of change, such as violence or something like that. So to talk to people about why capitalism should be replaced is fundamentally a question of indicating what goals one holds the political economic system should have that the existing capitalist system is not achieving, and then to argue against reformism, one would also need to argue why, by the nature of capitalism, it cannot promote these goals. So that's exactly what many advocates of socialism have done for the last 150 years or so. So now to be concrete, because I always try to be concrete, i.e. not just leaving it at the goals of socialism, but rather be more concrete on what these goals are, I will present two lists of goals of socialism as they have been defined in the real world and in social practice in fighting for a better world than capitalism for the last 150 years. Note that there's no claim here that these lists are exhaustive. There are other goals people have put forward, but there is a claim that these two lists cover the large majority of what people have repeatedly put forward as goals of socialism over the last 150 years. And also there's a broad, even if not absolute, agreement among advocates of socialism that these things should be among the goals of socialism. I have divided the goals of socialism that have been historically argued for as the basis for the need for socialism into two somewhat qualitatively different types of goals, what I have called broad goals and what I have called concrete specific goals. Again, stressing that there's no claim here that these being exhaustive, I list here 9 broad goals and 8 concrete specific goals. Okay, examples of the broad goals. Humans collectively make their own history. They're collectively the subjects of their own history. They collectively determine their own fate. Second one is society collectively controls all its own institutions, social self-determination, social self-governance, socialist democracy. Third one is self-emancipation or liberation, or equivalently indicating this goal by the results of emancipation or liberation, freedom or liberty. Again, talking about broad goals, we have the traditional ones: solidarity, equality, elimination of exploitation, that no one lives from appropriation of the results of the work of others, elimination of all types of oppression, meaningful work, work that supports and develops the worker's potential humanity, and environmental and ecological sustainability. Talking about specific concrete goals of socialism, these of course is sort of a laundry list, which we all know. Adequate healthy food, universal free healthcare, universal free education, humanly dignified housing, adequate time not engaged in social work, including limits on working hours per day and working days per week, adequate vacations, compensation, comprehensive social security, abolition of child labor, social control over production, and so on and so on. Okay, so like many other advocates of socialism over the last 2 centuries, this author often finds it convenient and pedagogically useful in some situations to talk about socialism as having a single goal, the goal of human development. Marx and Engels often referred to human development as the goal of their concept of socialism. To randomly pick 2 examples, in 1845, Marx and Engels wrote about the free activity, which is for the communists the creative manifestation of life arising from the free development of all the abilities of the whole person. Well, 2 years later, Engels wrote about the goal of the all-around development of the abilities of all members of society. Of course, changing from talking about a plethora of goals to a single goal cannot possibly change the nature of the problem in the real world of needing to socially develop the concept of what socialism is as part of the process of making a better world in capitalism. In this frame of a single goal, all the things that promote human development that capitalism does not promote, or it even blocks, are sub-goals of promoting human development, and hence of promoting socialism. And of course, those are exactly all the same things listed in the multi-goal frame as the goals of socialism. So notwithstanding the equivalent of the 2 approaches in this sense, sometimes the frame of a single goal of human development is just pedagogically easier to present than talking about the plethora of things socialism will do for humans that capitalism does not. Hence, people thinking about socialism and this central issue of its goals should be aware that over the last 150 years, advocates have discussed the goals of socialism in both ways. Often the same people use both approaches, the plethora approach and the single goal approach, such as Marx and Engels, depending upon the point they're trying to make. Further, there's many different ways that a person can choose, and they have chosen, to express the single goal of human development. As examples, here are 5 such alternative ways to human development to express the same idea. One way, which we just saw examples of from Marx and Engels, is to talk about the development of humans' potential. Note that when one thinks of this, one should, as Marx and Engels did, make clear that they are talking of human potential in both the sense of each individual developing their own individual potential, and also in the sense of the development of the potential of humanity, of the human species. Just reflect, for example, on the development of humans' potential represented by the development of writing, and so on. Another way to express the same idea is as the development of humans' capabilities, or equivalently abilities, a way that in our time has gained favor with many progressives through the work of Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen. Bringing in the historical elements of this development in relation to our development as the human species, in 1961, Erich Fromm wrote, "The history of mankind is a history of the development of man," which of course today he would more correctly have written as humanity and as humans. And while there are lots of other expressions for this same idea of human development, such as simply becoming more fully human, the expression that I like best, because it's so rich, but also therefore slightly too long to be convenient to use in our world of sound bites, comes from Paulo Freire in his famous book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He refers to humanity's ontological and historical vocation to become more fully human. Note that here, in addition to the historical dimension of Fromm, that the history of humanity has been precisely the development of their potential humanity, Freire sees this as humanity's ontological vocation. Humans develop their humanity because that is what humans do by their nature of being humans. So we spent a fair amount of time on the goals of socialism because if I was asked why I promote the features of PROPLASO that I do, I could not give an answer without making clear the goals. With those goals now established, I hope I can present the next 2 points quickly. Note in passing, some of the points made in these parts will already rest on the goals of socialism that we've established. Yep, is that right? Yes, 12, good. Part 2, why develop previsions or prefigurative models of a desirable alternative to capitalism? So here I'm going to give 2 answers, one based on the changes of modes of production throughout history, and one based on the desired result of the change of the capitalist mode of production. We have seen a goal of socialism is to replace capitalism to be able to achieve its many other goals. Throughout history, every change of a mode of production was driven by the new ruling class, sometimes ruling on popular discontent, sometimes simply by force of arms. Socialism has no ruling class, so to generate a force able to make the change requires winning broad popular support to oppose the force of arms of the capitalist ruling class. Such popular support requires previsions of socialist alternatives that are socially broadly held previsions. The second argument is that a goal of the change is to generate a society with social self-determination or governance. While not a logical impossibility that some small force could overthrow the old order and then turn over the power they gained to society as a whole, it's been a staple of socialist theory for the last 150 years that in the real world, to achieve democratic planned socialism, taking power from the capitalists needs to be done by society itself. If some small group overthrew the existing system, and even if they then built a non-capitalist mode of production, it would retain power for itself and so not achieve the goal that we talked about of social self-determination and governance. Okay, that was part 2. Part 3 already. Part 3 of the presentation. So while we have just argued for the value of previsions to the struggle to build democratic planned socialism, they also present a double-sided danger, which can be called the Goldilocks dilemma. Or for those of you who recall reading Homer's Odyssey, it could well be called the Scylla and Charybdis dilemma. On the one hand, the prevision or collective prevision must be detailed enough to convince the masses that a human-centered alternative to capitalism is viable. If because it is not, if because it is just some vague, we will eliminate private ownership of the means of production and hence produce production for profit and replace it with production for social welfare, it will not provide an adequate sense that such an alternative is possible in the face of the socially omnipresent propaganda campaign that any such system must be too inefficient and without individual motivation to function. And so even with massive social discontent with the existing system of production, discontent will only bog down into it's bad, but there really is no alternative. On the other hand, models specifying every detail known in the literature as blueprints or recipes, for example, Charles Fourier's phalanxes proposed in 1808 with 1,620 people in each one and the exact jobs of each person specified, leave no room for actors to make any decisions on the operation of the new system. It's all predetermined. And that violates our specified goal for our socialism of self-determination, self-governance. Okay, part 4. Part 4 of this presentation, before turning to a preliminary but somewhat extended consideration of the features of PROPLASO itself, I want to quickly say 3 final background things, 3 things about democratic planned socialism models as a family. First, about the various models as competitors versus being complements. Second, about the advocates of one model presenting and explaining their models by focusing on the differences with other democratic planned socialism models, as opposed to explaining their features as constructed to meet the goals of their system. And third, the significance of features that are robust across models. The first one. Okay, the first comment on the democratic planned socialism family. I see the various DPS previsions as complements in their social role. Various DPS models, DPS family members, are not competing for a best DPS model prize. Rather, all are advocating that society would be better off if it replaced capitalism with DPS. People hearing about any one prevision opens them up to thinking about, and then the necessary social discussion on, what a more human-centered system of social production would look like. Second comment on the family, the DPS family. Comparing both the feasibility and desirability of differences between models can support and promote further thinking about how to build DPS models. Generally, however, as opposed to comparative presentations that argue why a model is better than other DPS models, the cause of society replacing capitalism with DPS is better served by an advocate of a particular model of DPS focusing their advocacy on positive presentations of their model, arguing why it is good at achieving what they understand as the goals of democratic planned socialism. Further, the social image of a broad group of people advocating DPS as a better world and having discussions among themselves concerning the details of how to actualize DPS is an image that can attract people to its ideas. The image of a group of sectarians all claiming to be advocating DPS, but in fact spending large amount of their time and advocacy arguing with each other about why their flavor of DPS is better than some other flavors, is not an image that promotes broad social attraction to DPS. Okay, the third comment on the DPS family, I argue that features that are the same or very nearly the same in many models of the DPS family, features that are fairly robust, of course, across many different models of DPS, are features that are most likely to be used in real-world social experiments to build DPS in the future. Okay, so that's it for the background for thinking about PROPLASO. And so now on to some features of the prevision. Okay, I'm not doing too bad. Okay, part 5. Viewed in its most general level, the prefigurative PROPLASO model has 3 pillars: protagonistic collective self-governance, socially planned socially economic production, and developmental labor. I will talk about 4 procedures that are part of PROPLASO's protagonistic collective self-governance, and 5 general procedures, and then 12 mid-level concrete proposals. Recall, we consciously do not want to specify detailed procedures for its economic planning. Okay, so the first one, talking about the first pillar. As we look at all these procedures of governance and planning in PROPLASO, one generally can see immediately that their connection to achieving particular goals in democratic planned socialism that we discussed as the first point of this presentation, just making the connection back to the goals that we opened up this thing with. The first procedure of protagonistic collective self-governance is protagonism in all its activities in PROPLASO. There exists a class of beings with guaranteed healthy food, guaranteed medical care, adequate and often, if it helps profits, air-conditioned housing. It's cows in the developed world. The requirement of protagonism establishes that the goal of PROPLASO is not just good conditions of life, but rather a life that one collectively controls. The first three broad goals of socialism that were discussed at the very beginning of this talk all directly called for protagonism, and of course the term self that is in those goals, self-determination, self-governance, self-emancipation, always indicates protagonism. I hope to have time to say a little more on this in the final section of the presentation on human nature, and we can also return to it in the questions and comment periods, but I want to keep moving along right now. The second procedure is to assure the collective nature of the protagonistic governance. This is a pretty common goal held by almost all socialist previsions, and so I'm not going to say much more on this right now, but again, I hope to return to it in the final section on human nature. I want to underline the importance of discursive democracy, occasionally also called deliberative democracy. Standard liberal democratic voting theory and the larger field of social choice theory and economics and political science that it's part of has people deciding what they want before the social action of making a social choice. And the expression of what they want, the utility function in economics, is only allowed to have things in it for oneself. People are restricted to being isolated individuals. If one is allowed, if it is allowed for me to get utility from a neighbor having something, then even the weak Pareto optimality results of economics break down. And beyond that, Arrow's impossibility theorem shows the impossibility of combining this type of individual preferences into a group preference by ranked choice voting systems that is both rational and fair, which is defined by 5 criteria. What people do in the real world, however, as Eleanor Olstom's research demonstrated, is they solve such problems. She looked especially at the made-up problem of the tragedy of the commons by discussing issues out with other members of society before voting or otherwise deciding. Research shows that for many people, they will vote differently after they know what is important to other people and why, and self-evidently, such results would tend to be more socially harmonious. So that issue of discursive democracy is very important. In discussions on socialist democracy, or a simple dichotomy is often presented between the center or the top and the grassroots. PROPLASO argues decisions should be made by the group that is strongly affected by the decision. Whether to have a bakery in a neighborhood or some local food processing operation of locally produced food need not be decided by the center of a country of, say, 10 million people. On the other hand, if the country needs to produce cement, then it will need only 2 or 3 such units for the needs of the whole country, and so local neighborhoods should not be deciding if they want to build a cement factory or not. Rather, that needs to be decided on the national level by the whole society, since it strongly affects everyone in the country. The principle is that because the scale of people's different collective interests differ, different social decisions should be made on different levels, the levels of the collectivity of that shared interest. This means there will need to be social discussions on the demarcation for each decision, of course. Of course, even under capitalism, some social decisions are made at the national level, some regionally, some locally, though often they are made there for reasons of who makes what gains from the decision as opposed to the size of the collective that's affected by the decisions. Okay, so that's on the protagonistic collective self-governance. So now let's move to the second pillar of PROPLASO, where I'm going to talk about 5 general procedures and then 12 other procedures, except for I may cut the 12 procedures because it may get too long, but we'll see. Okay, 5 general procedures for Pillar 2 of PROPLASO, socially planned social economic production. General Procedure 1, distinct from many other models of democratic planned socialism, and I must say influenced by the theory that underlies the attempt to build a new model of socialism in Cuba without indicating in any way that PROPLASO strongly resembles what's going on there now. The requirement of a planned economy does not require all productive units to be state-owned. In PROPLASO, there will be state-owned and non-state-owned productive units, with society planning all social production, and the mechanisms for doing so differing greatly from the state and the non-state sectors. Non-state does not mean capitalist, and there will be no capitalist productive units. General Procedure 2. Markets will be used for some of the necessary exchanges between production units and by consumers in obtaining individual consumer goods. So the model will have markets, but there'll be no circuits of capital. General Procedure 3. Two prices will exist for every social product. Its market price, which it's actually exchanged at, and its labor price. Note that both are administered prices. The state set or determined prices. This is the procedure that's going to be used in investment, which I probably won't go into too much detail on, but it's used for that. Okay, general procedure number 4. The means of production, such as machines that are used in production for many years until they are either worn out or obsolete, will be produced and used as any intermediate inputs. And general procedure 5, much of the planning is done by marginal adjustment. The determination of the amounts of most large-scale and even many small-scale social productions will consist of protagonistic collective self-governance decisions determining marginal adjustments from the previous period, rather than trying to determine some precise social preferences by asking everyone every period, how much do you want of everything? And I'll illustrate this in just a minute. Okay, the slides that I originally made from 21 to 25 go into 12 mid-level concrete procedures, but I think I'm going to abbreviate them. I want to talk about this first one a lot, but then I want to get on to some other things. Slide 21 to 25 go into 12 mid-level concrete procedures. Going through my talk, I found that it was kind of long, so I'm going to cut those, except this slide 21, which I want to present both since it's the starting of the concrete planning procedure each cycle, and because it illustrates what I was saying concerning marginal adjustment procedures. After this initial determination of the macro division of production in this first step, actually, I think I'll read that one first, and then I'll say that. Okay, so this very first procedure is there's going to be the national population will vote to directly determine, and that means they'll marginally adjust from the previous time period, the major uses of the current GDP by first dividing it between current consumption and investment, and then dividing current consumption between collective consumption and individual consumption. And so, what one could do is say every period, you could say, okay, population, how much do you want of each of the three things? So how much, of the total GDP we're going to produce, how much do you want to go into investment? How much do you want to go into collective goods? How much do you want to go into private consumer goods? But, that's ridiculous. And, people coming up with numbers 47 per 60. And so what the basic idea is like this and many other things. Each year, you'll look at how it was the year before. And you'll ask people, does it seem like we had too much of this? Does it seem like we have too little of that? Would you like to move this up? Would you like to move this down? And that's how you can make these major decisions in an ongoing way without having something ridiculous like asking the whole population, how do you want to divide the GDP between three things? So that'll be the first step of the planning each time. The population will indicate how much of the total GDP produced is going to go into investment and how much is going to go into collective goods and how much is going to go into private goods. Okay, after this first step, and again, this is written out more fully in the paper, the next 10 steps that I go into give mid-level concrete indications of how the system will produce three different types of goods: collective and other free goods, it's the one type, individual consumer goods, and then investment goods. Okay, the three types of goods, the three divisions that the GDP was made into. In all cases, first, a social demand is determined, and this is done differently for the different types of goods. Then supply is produced to meet the determined demand. For each good, it is discussed how to be sure no goods are produced that harm the environment. So it has discussion of the environmental protections. Nor are any renewable resources, like fish, for example, produced at levels above their sustainable thresholds. The final of the 12 procedures talks about the role of workers' councils in the planning process. Okay, so that's all I want to say about the specifics, and I can answer more questions when we get to that. These are all the specifics. I want to go through those and move towards ending. So I want to talk about human nature at the end. And I want to talk about the sixth point of the talk, human nature, which I already argued before, is actually in some sense a precursor to the goals that are done. So I want to talk about really two things in human nature. I want to talk about our collectivity, and our collectivity brings up the issue of our individuality. And I want to talk about our conscious activity. And I think as we talk about I'm going to read 5 quotes. The quotes are a little bit long, but I think as we read them, you'll see how they immediately tie back to the goals that were postulated as the beginning of the socialism. So I'm going to talk about one example of our collective social species being. I'm going to talk about 2 examples concerning the social individual, because this issue of hyper-individuality is so important. Ever since the 1980s, it's expanded, and it's permeated the left. I mean, it's at the basis of neoliberalism, but it's permeated the left as well. So I want to talk about that, and the idea of the individual. And then I want to talk about conscious activity, which ties into the idea of protagonism. So this is the first of the 5. This is on the collective and social species being. Since human nature is the true community of men, by manifesting their nature, men create, they produce the human community, the social entity, which is no abstract universal power opposed to the single individual, but is the essential nature of each individual, his own activity, his own life, his own spirit, his own wealth. And as long as man does not recognize himself as man, and therefore has not organized the world in a human way, this community appears in the form of estrangement, because its subject, man, is being estranged from himself. And I would argue this idea of estrangement from society is very much, again, permeates the left and their ideas of building alternative societies. This sort of fear of any larger collective than the immediate collective, where you can see everybody eyeball to eyeball. Okay, so that's on this idea of our collective and social species being, and I want to connect it to that is this idea of the individual. And what I want to argue very much is, we don't want to give up the grounds of, to the right wing of, they believe in individuality, we believe in collectivity, and so we all wear gray Mao suits and, so forth and so on. We believe in individuality, but we believe in a collective individuality as opposed to an isolated individual. It's just like we don't want to give up the idea of democracy to them because, we have a different idea of what democracy is. So we have individuality, but the really point is that it's the way it is in the real world. Our individuality is very much shaped by the society that we live in. I mean, that's the whole point. It's not too deep, but above all, we must avoid postulating society, again, as an abstraction vis-a-vis the individual. Okay, they're not opposite. The individual is the social being. Okay, that's the whole point. We are social individuals. His manifestation of life, even if they may not appear in the direct form of communal manifestation. So even when they appear in capitalism for something, carried out in association with others, are therefore an expression and confirmation of social life. Man's individual and species life are not different. However much, and this is inevitable, the mode of existence of the individual is more particular or more general mode of life of the species, or the life of the species is a more particular or more general than the individual. Okay, and then a second one, again, hammering away at this issue of the individuality, which we are into. I mean, that's the whole point of Marx's project, was that capitalism was preventing the development of each individual's potential humanity. He was very concerned with the individual. Anyways, example 2, the point is rather that private interest is itself already a socially determined interest, and can be attained only within the conditions laid down by society and within the means provided by society, and is therefore tied to the reproduction of these conditions and means. It is the interest of private persons, but its content, as well as the form and means of its realization, are given by social conditions that are independent of them all. Okay, on the social individual versus the isolated individual of standard economic theory and standard liberal political theory. Okay, now I want to talk about consciousness, and this thing I think I will argue ties back very directly to the whole idea of protagonism, which was so important to the ideas of socialism, particularly in Marx and Engels. Example here, this is the one we all know. We all know and love about the bees, so we can practically recite it by heart. We are not now dealing with those primitive instinctive forms of labor that remind us of the mere animal. We presuppose labor in a form stamps it as in a form that stamps it as exclusively human. A spider conducts operations that resemble those of a weaver, and a bee puts to shame many an architect in the construction of her cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of the bees is this: the architect raises his construction in imagination before he erects it in reality. At the end of every labor process, we get a result that already exists in the imagination of the laborer at its commencement. He not only affects a change in form of the material on which he works, but he also realizes a purpose of his own. Again, this ties back to the idea of protagonism, self-emancipation, self-governance, etc., etc. Okay, example 2, and then I'll go to the conclusion. With the seizing of the means of production by society, production of commodities is done away with, and simultaneously the mastery of the product over the producer. The struggle for individual existence disappears. Okay, so there you're actually talking about the collectivity point again, even though I have it here for its consciousness point. The whole sphere of the conditions of life which environ man and which have hitherto ruled man now come under his domain and control of man, for the first time becomes the real, conscious, Lord of nature, and Lord of nature, we have to interpret that as not a domination and elimination of nature, but anyway, because he now has become master of his own social organization. Only from that time will man himself, with full consciousness again, make his own history. Only from that time will the social causes set in movement by him have, in the main and in a constantly growing measure, the results intended by him. It is humanity's leap from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. Okay, 3 paragraphs as a conclusion. 2 of them from the conclusion of the article, which I referred to you to from my webpage or from Science and Society, and then a final paragraph. So as a conclusion, I want to present 2 paragraphs with which I concluded and summarized the 2022 article in it on PROPLASO, and then with a paragraph indicating the general nature of planning and democratic planned socialist models, which one sees also in the PROPLASO model. Discontent with the existing world-dominating capitalist system is at its highest since World War II and growing. Society will not carry out the difficult struggle against the minority who benefit from the existing order unless it believes an alternative, which avoids what they find unacceptable in the existing system, is viable. Models that envision socialism need to be understood not as recipes for what must be, but rather as part of the social conversation necessary to raise the belief that a better world is possible to social predominance. Those people who make the transformation must necessarily be those who decide what ideas from the plethora of viable proposals they believe will best serve their goal of developing their humanity. The goal of each of PROPLASO's concrete proposals is to support and promote socialism's overall goal of human development and its many sub-goals that concretize that. The proposals generally arise out of negating procedures in capitalism that prevent the human development, which these new procedures are supposed to support and promote. They should be evaluated against both capitalism and against any alternative non-capitalist model or narrower non-capitalist operational procedure, not just necessarily for the whole system, for planning, in terms of how well they are considered to achieve those goals. How does democratic planned socialism plan in general, and as opposed to capitalism? In democratic planned socialism, social demand is determined through bodies set up by democratic collective self-governance procedures. Then supply is determined to match that demand either through democratic collective self-governance procedures or through the regulation of production units not run by society, cooperatives, self-employment, household production, through social control of prices, and with that regulation also including the protection of the environment. The goal of the social production units is to meet their agreed on goal of production, and the other units are producing what they feel they want to in order to obtain the overall amounts of goods they wish to consume. Capitalist production units, to the contrary, produce to maximize profits. They also, and as individual capital, determine demand, but only demand for their products, and then their production decision is not to match that demand, but to produce whatever maximizes their profits. And all of this with no concern for protecting the environment. Finally, on what PROPLASO is, and more broadly, democratic planned socialism does, recall that in the Soviet bureaucratic developmentalist mode of production, also determined demand and then attempted to cause supply to meet that. But in contrast to democratic planned socialism, it does not determine demand by democratic institutions or procedures, nor run their production units democratically either. And that's it.
Okay, thank you very kindly, Dr. Campbell. Now we will stop recording.